The tension in the terminal. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of a Monday morning. Heels clacked against the polished floors, rolling suitcases hummed past, and voices rose and fell like waves. Among the ebb and flow of hurried travelers, Major Elise Carter stood at the security checkpoint, her crisp military uniform catching the light. The insignia on her chest glinted subtly, a silent testament to years of dedication and sacrifice. Elise had long since learned to ignore the looks that followed her when she was in uniform. Some were filled with respect, others with curiosity, and a few with veiled discomfort. She never knew what triggered the latter, her rank, her gender, her skin color, or all three. But she'd stopped trying to figure it out. Instead, she carried herself with the unshakable confidence of someone who had faced far bigger challenges than judgmental stares. As she approached the ticket counter, the agent behind the desk greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning, ma'am." "Thank you for your service," the woman said, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. Elise offered a polite nod. "Good morning. I'm here to check in for Flight 482 to Chicago." "Of course," the agent replied. A moment later, she handed Elise her ticket. "You're in seat 22A, right by the window." "Perfect. Thank you," Elise said as she tucked the boarding pass into her jacket pocket. She preferred the window seat. It gave her a small escape, something to look at when the world inside the plane felt too close. The security line was long, but Elise didn't mind. She used the time to glance around, taking in the familiar tapestry of travelers. There were families with young children, their parents looking exhausted but patient. Businesspeople in tailored suits tapped furiously on their phones, their faces set in expressions of mild annoyance. And then there were the solo travelers like Elise, each one moving with quiet purpose, their destination known only to them. As she placed her carry-on and shoes on the conveyor belt, Elise noticed a man in the adjacent line. He was tall, with graying hair and a tailored suit that looked expensive but understated. Something about him caught her attention, not his appearance, but the way he was staring at her. It wasn't a fleeting glance, it was the kind of look that lingered just a second too long. Elise held his gaze for a moment before turning away, her expression impassive. She wasn't new to this. Over the years, she'd learned to recognize the subtle cues of disapproval or discomfort. Whether it was her uniform or the color of her skin, she couldn't say, but the man's stare left an impression. By the time she reached her gate, the terminal was filling up with passengers. Elise found an empty seat near the window and settled in, pulling out her tablet to check emails. She had just started scrolling through her inbox when she heard a familiar voice. "Excuse me, miss?" She looked up to see the man from the security line standing in front of her. Up close, he looked even more imposing, broad-shouldered, with sharp features and an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. "Yes?" Elise replied, her tone polite but guarded. "Are you on this flight?" he asked, gesturing to the gate sign. "Yes, I am." The man's eyes flicked to her uniform, then back to her face. "Which seat are you in?" Elise hesitated. 22A, she said finally. A shadow crossed the man's face. "I see." He didn't elaborate, but his lips pressed into a thin line before he walked away. Elise watched him go, a sense of unease settling over her. She tried to shake it off, reminding herself that she didn't owe him, or anyone else, an explanation for her presence. When boarding was announced, Elise waited for her group to be called before making her way to the plane. As she stepped into the narrow aisle, she spotted her seat near the middle of the coach section. She placed her carry-on in the overhead bin and slid into the window seat, grateful for the quiet. A few minutes later, the man appeared again. He stopped at her row, his expression a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. "You're in 22A?" he asked, as though confirming it was some kind of mistake. "That's correct," Elise replied evenly. "I'm in 22B, he said, holding up his ticket. His tone carried a note of irritation, as though her presence was a personal inconvenience. Elise gestured to the empty seat beside her. "Looks like we're neighbors, then." The man didn't respond. Instead, he glanced around the cabin, as if searching for a flight attendant. When he spotted one, he flagged her down. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Is there another seat available? I'd prefer not to sit here." The attendant frowned, clearly taken aback. "I'm sorry, sir, but the flight is fully booked. Everyone must remain in their assigned seats." The man's jaw tightened. "There must be some mistake," he said, his tone growing sharper. "I specifically requested an aisle seat in a different section." "I understand, sir, but there's nothing I can do," the attendant replied, her professionalism unwavering. With a reluctant sigh, the man finally sat down, leaving an exaggerated amount of space between himself and Elise. He didn't say another word, but his body language spoke volumes. He angled himself away from her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Elise turned to look out the window, her reflection staring back at her. She felt a familiar mix of emotions, frustration, hurt, and the quiet resolve that had carried her through countless other moments like this one. She wasn't sure what this man's problem was, but she wasn't about to let it ruin her journey. Still, as the plane began to taxi down the runway, a question lingered in her mind: why did her mere presence seem to unsettle him so much? A turbulent silence. The plane hummed softly as it ascended into the sky, breaking through thick clouds until the landscape below became a patchwork of fields and cities. The cabin settled into a peaceful rhythm, passengers leaning back in their seats, conversations dwindling to murmurs, and the faint clinking of glasses as the flight attendants prepared their service carts. Elise stared out the window, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. The view outside was serene, but the atmosphere beside her was thick with tension. Robert Langston, as she'd overheard the man introduce himself to the flight attendant earlier, sat rigid in 22B. His shoulders were stiff, his posture unnaturally upright, as if he feared touching the seat beside him. Elise could feel his discomfort as acutely as if it were her own. His body angled slightly away from her, creating a visible divide. It wasn't the typical flight companion awkwardness, it was something more profound. She glanced at his hands resting on his lap, knuckles taut. The faint tan line where a wedding ring might have once been hinted at a story she wasn't privy to. A man like him, sharp, meticulous, and accustomed to control, was clearly out of his element, though why her presence triggered such a reaction remained a mystery. The flight attendant wheeled the service cart down the aisle, her cheerful voice cutting through the uneasy silence. "Would you care for something to drink?" she asked, stopping at their row. Elise smiled politely. "Just water, please." Robert cleared his throat. "Coffee. Black." As the attendant handed Elise her water, Robert huffed softly, muttering something under his breath. "Excuse me?" Elise asked, keeping her tone measured. "You could have passed me the coffee," he said, barely looking at her. Elise blinked, taken aback by the pettiness of the remark. For a moment, she considered letting it slide, but something inside her refused. She had faced far greater challenges than a rude seatmate, yet this small act of disrespect gnawed at her. "I wasn't aware I was your server," she said calmly, her gaze steady. Robert's eyes flicked to her, surprised by her directness. He opened his mouth as if to respond but seemed to think better of it, turning back to his coffee instead. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting them slightly. A few passengers gasped, gripping their armrests. Elise remained unfazed, accustomed to far rougher rides during her service. Robert, however, looked visibly tense, his hand tightening around the armrest. "You all right?" Elise asked, surprising even herself with the question. "I'm fine," he said tersely, though the sweat beading at his temple suggested otherwise. Elise considered leaving it at that but decided against it. "You know, Focusing on a fixed point outside can help with turbulence. Takes your mind off the bumps. Robert glanced at her, skepticism evident. You sound like you've done this before. I have, she said simply. Air Force pilot. His eyebrows lifted slightly, the first crack in his stony demeanor. A pilot? Yes, she confirmed. 15 years of service. He seemed to process this information, his expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded. That explains the uniform. Elise nodded. It does. There was a beat of silence before he spoke again. I guess you've seen your share of turbulence, then. You could say that. As the turbulence subsided, Robert took a sip of his coffee, his posture relaxing marginally. Elise thought the conversation was over, but he surprised her by continuing. My son wanted to be a pilot, he said suddenly, his voice softer. He was obsessed with planes as a kid. Built models, read every book he could get his hands on. Elise sensed the weight behind his words. Did he join the Air Force? Robert's jaw tightened. No. He didn't get the chance. Lost him in a car accident when he was 18. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unfiltered. Elise's heart ached for him. She knew the kind of grief that clung to you, reshaping your world in its aftermath. I'm sorry, she said sincerely. Robert nodded curtly, his gaze distant. It was a long time ago, but some losses never really leave you. I understand, Elise said gently. I've lost people too. It changes you. He looked at her, something softening in his eyes. I suppose it does. The flight continued in a tentative silence, but the atmosphere had shifted. The wall between them had cracked, if only slightly. Elise found herself thinking about the assumptions people made, the way they judged without knowing the full story. Robert's initial hostility hadn't been about her, not entirely. It had been about his pain, his grief, and the memories that surfaced when he saw her uniform. As the plane began its descent, Elise decided to extend a small olive branch. She pulled a notepad from her bag and wrote a brief message. Folding the paper neatly, she slid it onto Robert's tray table. He looked at her quizzically before unfolding the note. His eyes scanned the words, and his expression softened. Life has turbulence, but it helps to have a co-pilot. If you ever need one, even for a conversation, just know that some of us understand. Robert read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice sincere. Elise smiled faintly. Safe travels, Mr. Langston. As the plane touched down, she felt a strange sense of peace. Sometimes, the simplest gestures, a conversation, a note, could change the trajectory of a journey. And perhaps, just perhaps, it could change someone's perspective too. Crossroads and conversations. The terminal was alive with motion as passengers disembarked, stretching their legs and checking their phones for updates. Elise walked calmly down the jet bridge, the familiar rhythm of her boots striking the metal ramp echoing faintly behind her. She adjusted her duffel bag on her shoulder, her mind still turning over the unexpected conversation with Robert Langston. People like him were set in their ways, successful, authoritative, and often insulated by privilege. Yet something about their exchange had chipped away at that hard exterior. Elise had sensed a vulnerability beneath his polished demeanor, a longing for something simpler, perhaps even freer. She reached the gate area and was about to continue toward the baggage claim when she heard a voice behind her. Major Carter. Elise turned to see Robert weaving through the crowd, his leather briefcase in hand. His expression was uncharacteristically open, lacking the guarded intensity she'd seen on the plane. You forgot something, he said, catching up to her. Elise frowned. I don't think so. He held up the folded note she had given him. Your words are stuck in my head, and I'm not sure whether to thank you or blame you. Elise chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. Robert smiled faintly. Look, I know you probably have somewhere to be, but, would you mind grabbing a coffee? My treat. Elise hesitated. She was used to moving on without looking back, but something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the sincerity in his eyes or the simple fact that he'd bothered to catch up with her at all. All right, she agreed. But I'm picking the place. Airport coffee is terrible. They found a quiet cafe just outside the terminal, away from the bustling foot traffic. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as they settled into a booth near the window. So, Robert began, stirring his coffee, what made you write that note? Elise took a sip of her latte before answering. Sometimes people need a reminder that their story isn't finished. You looked like someone who might need that reminder. Robert nodded thoughtfully. Fair enough. And you? What's your story? Elise smiled wryly. You sure you want to hear it? It's not exactly light reading. I'm a lawyer, remember? I live for long-winded narratives. Elise leaned back in her seat, considering where to begin. I grew up in a small town in Georgia. My dad was a mechanic, and my mom worked at the post office. We didn't have much, but they taught me the value of hard work and integrity. Sounds like good people, Robert said. They were, Elise agreed, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. My dad was the one who sparked my love for aviation. He used to take me to air shows when I was a kid. I knew I wanted to fly before I was 10. And you made it happen, Robert said, admiration evident in his tone. It wasn't easy, Elise admitted. The Air Force wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for women, let alone women of color. But I was determined. I had to be. Robert's expression grew somber. I imagine you faced your share of obstacles. You could say that, Elise said carefully. But I learned to navigate the turbulence, both in the air and on the ground. He nodded slowly. You make it sound simple, but I'm guessing it wasn't. Elise's gaze met his. It never is. But that's life, isn't it? You keep pushing forward, even when the odds are stacked against you. Robert tapped his fingers on the table, lost in thought. You know, I've spent most of my life doing the opposite, playing it safe, staying within the lines. It's made me successful, but not happy? Elise finished gently. Something like that, he admitted. After my son died, I threw myself into work. It was easier than facing the grief. But now I'm realizing that maybe I've been stuck in autopilot for too long. Elise nodded, understanding all too well how grief could shape a person's choices. It's never too late to change course. Robert looked at her with renewed determination. Do you really believe that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't, Elise said firmly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the clatter of cups and low hum of conversations filling the space around them. Robert seemed lighter, as though shedding a burden he'd carried for years. I want to thank you, he said finally. Not just for the note, but for challenging me to think differently. Elise smiled. You're welcome. And thank you for trusting me enough to share your story. He extended his hand across the table. Clear skies ahead, right? Clear skies, Elise agreed, shaking his hand firmly. As they stood to leave, Robert hesitated. If you're ever in Chicago, look me up. I owe you more than just coffee. I might take you up on that, Elise said with a grin. They parted ways outside the cafe, each carrying a newfound sense of purpose. Elise watched Robert disappear into the crowd, a man at the crossroads of change. As she made her way toward the exit, Elise felt a sense of fulfillment. Life was full of turbulence, but sometimes all it took was a single connection to smooth the ride and set someone on a new path. And perhaps that was the greatest service of all, helping others find their way through the clouds. Unexpected encounters. The late afternoon sun bathed the city streets in a golden hue as Elise Carter emerged from the airport's main exit. The hustle and bustle of the terminal faded behind her, replaced by the rhythmic hum of traffic and the occasional chatter of passers-by. She pulled out her phone, scanning her messages for details about her next assignment briefing. Duty never waited long. Even with her brief time off, the Air Force had sent a new request for her tactical expertise. Elise had grown accustomed to the rapid shifts between civilian life and military operations, but something about this particular transition felt different. Perhaps it was the unexpected conversation with Robert Langston that lingered in her thoughts, or perhaps it was the note she'd written, a small gesture that had carried more weight than she initially realized. As she stood at the curb, waiting for her ride, a familiar voice called out behind her. "Major Carter." Elise turned, surprised to see Robert approaching with a determined stride. He looked slightly out of breath, his leather briefcase swinging at his side. "I thought we said our goodbyes back at the cafe," Elise said, amused. "We did," Robert admitted, "but I couldn't let you leave without saying one more thing." Elise crossed her arms, intrigued. "I'm listening." Robert hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "Meeting you today, it made me realize something. I've spent years being the guy who plays it safe, who avoids turbulence at all costs. But life isn't meant to be lived like that, is it?" "No, it's not," Elise agreed. "I've been thinking," he continued, "about my son, about the dreams I let slip away. I don't want to look back one day and realize I missed my chance to really live." Elise regarded him thoughtfully. "So what are you going to do about it?" Robert squared his shoulders, a spark of determination in his eyes. "I'm taking a leap. There's an aviation charity I've been supporting for years, helping underprivileged kids learn how to fly. I've always stayed behind the scenes, writing checks and attending fundraisers. But I want to get involved hands-on. Maybe even get my own pilot's license." A genuine smile spread across Elise's face. "Now that's the kind of turbulence worth embracing." "I thought you'd say that," Robert said with a laugh. Before Elise could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen, her commanding officer. "Duty called, as always." "I've got to take this," she said apologetically. "Of course," Robert said, understanding. "Thanks again, Elise. You've made more of an impact than you know." "Clear skies, Robert," she said with a nod before answering the call and walking toward her waiting car. Later that evening, Elise sat in her hotel room, reviewing the mission details on her tablet. The glow of the screen illuminated her thoughtful expression. The assignment was straightforward: liaison work with a foreign air force to enhance tactical coordination. It was important, no doubt, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation with Robert. She admired his courage. Change was never easy, especially for someone like him who thrived on structure and predictability. Yet he had chosen to step out of his comfort zone, inspired by a simple note and an unexpected encounter. Elise knew that her own journey had been shaped by similar moments, small yet significant events that had steered her course in unexpected directions. Her father's encouragement to chase her dreams, her commanding officer's unwavering belief in her potential, and the countless challenges that had tested her resolve. As she sat there, a sudden impulse struck her. She opened her email and composed a message to a contact she had at the aviation charity Robert mentioned. Subject: Potential volunteer interest. "Hi, I recently met someone who's passionate about supporting your program and might be interested in contributing hands-on. His name is Robert Langston, and I think he could bring a lot of value to your organization. Just thought I'd connect the dots." She hit send, feeling a sense of satisfaction. Sometimes, helping others navigate their path was as rewarding as finding your own. The next day, Elise arrived at the military base where the joint training exercises were scheduled. The air was thick with the scent of jet fuel and the low rumble of engines. Pilots and ground crews moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for the day's operations. Elise greeted her counterparts with a firm handshake, her presence commanding respect. Despite the intensity of the environment, her thoughts occasionally drifted back to Robert. She wondered if he had followed through on his newfound resolve or if the weight of his old life had pulled him back. As the day progressed, she immersed herself in the mission, her sharp mind and tactical expertise proving invaluable. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Elise felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Back at the barracks, she checked her phone and found an email waiting in her inbox. It was from the aviation charity. Subject: Thank you for the introduction. Hi Major Carter, thank you for connecting us with Robert Langston. He's already reached out and is eager to get involved. We're setting up a meeting next week to discuss how he can contribute. We appreciate your support. Elise smiled, a warm sense of pride filling her chest. Robert had taken the leap, just as she had hoped. As she set her phone aside, Elise reflected on the unpredictable nature of life. Sometimes it took a turbulent flight and a simple note to change everything. And sometimes, it took the courage to embrace the unknown and chase the clear skies ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, and new faces. But tonight, Elise allowed herself to savor the satisfaction of knowing that even in the midst of duty and responsibility, she had made a difference, not just for Robert, but perhaps for countless others who would benefit from his newfound passion. Life, after all, was a journey best navigated with courage and an open heart. And Elise Carter was always ready for the ride. Echoes of impact. The air was crisp as Elise Carter stood on the observation deck of the military base, watching the early morning drills unfold across the airfield. The rhythmic roar of jet engines and the glint of sunlight off sleek aircraft brought a sense of familiarity and comfort. This was her world, structured, disciplined, and mission-driven. Yet, recent events had reminded her that life wasn't always about staying on a predetermined course. She took a deep breath, savoring the moment of stillness before the day's operations began in earnest. Her mind wandered to Robert Langston and the surprising turn their chance encounter had taken. It wasn't often that strangers crossed paths and left a lasting mark on each other's lives, but that flight had done just that. The buzz of her phone broke her reverie. She pulled it from her pocket, surprised to see Robert's name on the screen. "Robert," she answered, a smile tugging at her lips. "Didn't expect to hear from you so soon." "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," Robert said, his voice steady but tinged with excitement. "Just watching jets take off, nothing urgent." "What's up?" "I had my first meeting with the aviation charity yesterday," he said. "They were incredibly welcoming and excited about my interest in volunteering. I can't believe I waited this long to get involved." Elisa's smile widened. "That's great to hear. What role are you thinking about?" "They want me to mentor some of the kids interested in aviation careers and help with fundraising strategy. And here's the kicker, I've already booked my first flying lesson next week." Elise laughed, genuinely delighted. "Look at you, jumping headfirst into turbulence." "I'm proud of you, Robert." "Thanks," he said sincerely. "I owe a lot of this to you, Elise. You made me realize that it was time to stop coasting and take control of my journey." "You're the one who made the decision," Elise said modestly. "I just handed you a nudge." "A nudge that changed everything," he insisted. "And there's more, I spoke to my firm this morning. I'm cutting back my hours to focus on this new path. Life's too short to spend it chained to a desk." Elisa's admiration for Robert grew. It took immense courage to step away from the familiar and forge a new path. "Sounds like you're on the right track. Clear skies ahead, right?" "Exactly," he said with a chuckle. "By the way, the charity wants to invite you to an event next month. They're hosting a showcase for the kids to present their aviation projects. It'd mean a lot if you could be there." Elise hesitated, her schedule typically unpredictable, but the sincerity in Robert's voice made her want to find a way. "I'll do my best. Send me the details." "Will do. Thanks again, Elise." "Really?" "You're welcome, Robert. Keep flying high." As the call ended, Elise felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Life had a way of connecting people at just the right moments, creating ripples that extended far beyond what anyone could predict. Later that day, Elise found herself in a strategy meeting with her commanding officers and the Foreign Air Force liaison team. The discussion was intense, focused on tactical scenarios and coordination protocols. Elise's sharp mind and years of experience made her an invaluable contributor, and her insights were met with nods of approval. As the meeting concluded, General Harper, a respected figure in the Air Force, approached her. "Major Carter," he said, his tone both respectful and curious, "your reputation precedes you. I've heard about your work in some of our most challenging operations." "Thank you, sir," Elise said, maintaining her professional demeanor. "You've got a knack for leadership and strategic thinking," he continued. "Ever considered moving into a higher command role?" Elise paused, the question catching her off guard. "I've always been focused on the mission at hand, sir." "Understandable," Harper said. "But we need leaders who can inspire and guide the next generation. Think about it." "I will, sir," Elise promised. As Harper walked away, Elise felt the weight of his words. Leadership was a natural extension of her role, but the idea of stepping further into the spotlight was both intriguing and daunting. That evening, Elise sat by the base's recreational area, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Her thoughts drifted to Robert's transformation and the general's proposition. Both were reminders that life was a series of crossroads, each offering a chance to redefine one's journey. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from the aviation charity. They had attached a photo from Robert's meeting, a group of enthusiastic kids gathered around a smiling Robert, who looked more alive than he had on that flight. "Thank you for the introduction. He's already making a difference." Elise's chest swelled with pride. She replied with a simple message. "Glad to hear it. Keep soaring." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Elise knew that her journey was far from over. The turbulence of life would always be there, but it was how you navigated it that defined the course. And Elise Carter was always ready to fly through the storm, knowing that clear skies waited on the other side. New horizons, new legacies. The week passed in a blur of strategy meetings, joint drills, and debriefings. Elise Carter thrived in high-stakes environments, her focus unwavering and her tactical mind sharp. But even amid the demands of military life, her thoughts occasionally drifted back to Robert Langston and the unexpected ripple effect of their encounter. Her work at the base concluded with commendations from both her commanding officer and the Foreign Air Force leadership. Elise had proven, yet again, that she was not only a skilled pilot but also a capable strategist and leader. As she packed up her belongings and prepared for her next assignment, a familiar voice called out. "Major Carter, got a minute?" She turned to see General Harper striding toward her, his presence commanding as always. "Yes, sir," she said, standing at attention. "At ease," he said with a faint smile. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation. Have you given any thought to stepping into a higher leadership role?" Elise hesitated. "I've been focused on the mission, sir. But your words did give me something to think about. You're a natural leader, Carter. You inspire those around you. That's a rare quality, and it's exactly what we need in our top brass. Think about it seriously. The Air Force could use more officers like you at the helm." "I appreciate your confidence, sir," Elise said sincerely. Harper nodded. "Take your time, but don't wait too long. The skies are always changing." As he walked away, Elise felt a mix of pride and apprehension. Leadership was a daunting prospect, but perhaps it was time to embrace a new challenge. 2 weeks later, Elise found herself back in civilian clothes, walking through the doors of the Aviation Charities event hall. The room buzzed with energy as young students showcased their aviation projects to an audience of parents, volunteers, and sponsors. Bright banners adorned the walls, and model planes of various sizes were displayed on tables. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air. Elise scanned the room, her eyes landing on Robert Langston, who was deep in conversation with a group of excited kids. He spotted her and broke into a wide smile. "Elise! You made it." "I did," she said, shaking his hand warmly. "Looks like things are going well here." "Better than I ever imagined," Robert said, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "These kids are incredible, so passionate and curious. It's contagious." "I can see that," Elise said, genuinely impressed. Robert gestured toward a nearby table. "Come meet one of our star students." A young girl with curly hair and bright eyes looked up as they approached. She had a model airplane in her hands, meticulously crafted and painted. "Major Carter, this is Jasmine," Robert introduced. "She's got a design for a lightweight, solar-powered drone that's pretty impressive." "Nice to meet you, Jasmine," Elise said, extending her hand. "Nice to meet you too, ma'am," Jasmine said shyly. "Mr. Langston said you're a pilot. Is that true?" "It is," Elise confirmed. "I've flown all kinds of aircraft, from fighter jets to transport planes." Jasmine's eyes widened. "Wow. Do you think I could fly one day?" Elise knelt to meet Jasmine's gaze. "Absolutely. You've got the passion and the brains. All you need is determination and a bit of hard work." Jasmine beamed. "Thank you, ma'am." As the girl returned to her project, Robert looked at Elise thoughtfully. "You're good with them. Ever thought about mentoring?" Elise laughed. "I think my schedule's a bit too unpredictable for that, but I'd love to stay connected with what you're doing here." "You're always welcome," Robert said earnestly. The event continued with speeches and presentations, culminating in a showcase where each student shared their project. Elise watched with pride as Jasmine confidently explained her drone design, her voice steady despite the large audience. As applause filled the room, Elise felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Moments like this reminded her why she had chosen a life of service, to inspire and uplift, to navigate turbulence and find clear skies. After the event, Robert and Elise stood by the entrance, watching families and volunteers mingle. "Thanks for coming, Elise," Robert said. "It meant a lot to the kids, and to me." "I wouldn't have missed it," she said sincerely. "You're doing incredible work here." "So are you," Robert said. "I've been keeping up with your assignments. You're making waves in the Air Force." "Just doing my part," Elise said modestly. "Sounds like you've got a decision to make about leadership," Robert said perceptively. "I do," Elise admitted. "But seeing what you've built here has given me a new perspective. Leadership isn't just about commanding, it's about guiding, inspiring, and making a difference." "You've already got that down," Robert said. "Thanks," Elise said thoughtfully. "We'll see where the winds take me." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Elise felt a sense of peace. Life was a journey filled with turbulence and unexpected encounters, but it was those very moments that shaped who you became. Robert Langston had found his calling, and Elise knew she was on the brink of embracing her own new horizon. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she was ready to navigate it with courage, resilience, and an open heart. Clear skies awaited, and Elise Carter was always ready to fly.